you expect to for them to continue pretty well all the way through the summer, and you get really cool areas like New Liskeard. They just keep going because it never gets too hot for them. Well, that's how I see it. Anyway, the next thing, runner production. Well, one thing that has been asked, and I'll go back, is that the terms day neutral, June bearing, what do they mean? Well, day neutral supposedly means that the plants are indifferent to day length, but we can see that you have to get up to the maximum temperatures before you can see any difference. So that has caused confusion in the terminology, but just think of it in terms of it's the maximum temperature at which they'll initiate, and then how they react to the day length. Okay, runner production. Well, runners are produced more at higher temperatures, more in longer day length. They are very day length sensitive. Day neutrals tend to have less than June bearing varieties, purely and simply because they're spending the effort producing fruit rather than producing runners. And to put on top of it, it's confounded by the ability to grow in short days. Basically, when you look at the strawberry varieties that are around in North America, there are kind of two types. There are the California and Florida varieties, which have been genetically, they've used germplasm, which has enabled those varieties to grow very successfully in short days. And then the northern varieties, which go dormant in short days as a reaction to, well, it's winter, we need to get cold resistance, we need to go to sleep, and they go dormant. And down here in Florida, you bring northern varieties down here, they literally stay dormant, even though it's big enough to warm, it's warm enough to grow, and the Florida and California varieties grow very successfully. Similarly, the California Florida varieties will grow up in our area, in the northern areas, but they tend to be have problems with winter hardiness. So probably the most good example of what happens to runner production is this work from Derner and Company in 1984, where they put different June bearing and day neutral varieties in growth chambers at different temperatures, and on the left you can see the day-night temperatures. They're looking at a 4-degree difference. In practice, I think in North America it's probably a day-night difference of around 12 degrees. And then they either grew them in short days or short days with a night interrupt. This is a plant physiology technique that we use to imitate long days, by if you give them a short period of low light in the middle of the night, the strawberries think they've had another day, and it acts as if they're in long days, and that way you've still got about the same amount of light energy involved, but you've lengthened the day from short to long. And the short day plants under June bearing plants under short days didn't produce runners until it got warm. When they had the night, they produced into long days, they produced it much more, but again you got the increase as the temperatures increased. The day neutrals under short days produced more runners, again a little bit more, and this I think is probably going back to that ability to grow in short days, which they've inherited from the California material. And when you put the night interrupt, you again got the same pattern, but it's kind of interesting to note that under the night interrupt, the day neutrals had less runners on average than the short day plants. And so this is the classical response of day neutrals, high temperature and long days. I know one grower in Ontario was growing his own runners, and he said, well, I'm not getting very many, Adam. I said, well, put a light night interrupt in, and he did, and instead of getting 5 or 6 runners, he got 20 or 30. So that day length is crucial in terms of runner production. So lastly, heat acclimation. Well, this is the ability of the plant to adapt to heat stress and what have you. There's relatively little information out there on what happens in strawberries, but we do know that strawberries can acclimate, and there are some points here that I want to make. One is that they're able to acclimate, and it varies considerably between the species and the variety, and we have to remember that the cultivated strawberry is made up of 2 original species, the Virginian from eastern North America and the Chilean from Chile and the west coast of North America, and so all sorts of things happen, different things there. But basically, if we talk in terms of photosynthesis, it's interesting that you look in the literature and they say that if you grow the plants below about 10 before you subject them to tests, you get most photosynthesis happening between 15 and 20 Celsius. If on the other hand you grow them at 20 to 30 degrees before you do the tests, you can move the optimum up to 25 C. I recently was at a conference and there was a gentleman from Switzerland talking about how he'd tested it in the field, and he found that the photosynthesis in the field in his plots was the highest rate of photosynthesis was at 30 Celsius, which is sort of higher than certainly I'd been led to think was what was happening. So obviously the plants are very adaptable in terms of that, and that's nice in terms of day neutrals. If 30 is the maximum of photosynthesis, it means you get really high yields and high temperatures. Then the other point that I want to do is talk about is skin colour. This is a comment that came up in Ontario in terms of acclimation. We have Cavendish, and you get some summers where Cavendish is nice red, others where the skin's gone pale, as if, call it albinism or whatever, and it makes it pale and it looks unmarketable. What's happening? Well, we had some studies and we ran Seascape and Honey Eye in 12-hour days at 2 very different temperatures, a 30-degree day and 18-degree night, 18-degree day and 6-degree night. And we potted plants up and we grew them in the growth chambers from potting all the way through to ripe fruit, and we split them up into 3 periods. The first period, which was from when we potted them up until they produced their first flowers. The second period was from first flower to when the king fruit was white, and then from white fruit to fully ripe. So what we do is put them in high temperatures or low temperatures and switch them round at the different stages. So you'd got plants that were always in high, plants that were always in low, and then plants that were switched between high and low in the different combinations. And at the end, one of the things that came out of it was the observation on what had happened to the skin colour, and it was kind of interesting. When you averaged them out, and this shows the average, my representation of the averages, under cold days, cool temperatures, when the fruit was ripe, you saw nice red ripe fruit, and if it was hot, often the fruit went white. That was at the ripe fruit stage. The middle stage, it really didn't matter too much, but what was interesting was when we went from potted till first flower and we kept those under high temperatures, we never saw any of the white fruit of the white skin at the ripe fruit stage, whereas if they were cold, kept in the cool, when we got to the ripe fruit stage, we saw a lot with white fruit. And for instance, you'd have high, and high, and those fruit were red. Whereas if you had low, and high, that fruit was white. So obviously the plant was adapting at the very early stage in the growing season to acclimate itself so that it was able to protect the fruit when it was ripe. And so when we think about heat acclimation, we have to think about processes that are happening a long time before. So is it a cold spring, hot spring? How's that going to affect things? Anyway, I've gone on long enough, and there's some of the things that I think are important in terms of strawberry physiology, in terms of day neutrals, around flower initiation. Runnering also has an effect, and I think we've only just started to understand how heat will affect the day neutrals. And there's one last thing you've got to remember, is every variety will act differently from every other variety. So you have to learn your varieties as you go through. Okay?
Thank you very much, Adam. I think we'll hold questions to the end so that we can keep on track. And so we're going to shift to our second speaker, who is Ms. Pam Fisher. Pam is a berry crop specialist for the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, based in Simcoe, Ontario. She graduated from the University of Guelph, where she studied agriculture and entomology. Pam works with growers, researchers, industry, and other AMAFRA specialists to bring new technology and information to producers. She is editor of the Ontario Berry Grower Newsletter and the Ontario Fruit Production Recommendations. She delivers pest management training to berry crop scouts in Ontario and is involved in field research and demonstration projects. She works very closely with the Ontario Berry Growers Association and the North American Strawberry Growers Association. Pam?
Hello, how are you? Good afternoon, everybody. I've just been chatting away in the box there, and I hope you're ready to go on to a new presentation. I'm talking about day-neutral strawberry varieties, not because I'm an expert at all, but because I do see different varieties as I travel across the province and listen to presentations in other areas. So I hope you feel free to comment on what I have to say about these varieties and that we all learn something. First of all, while Adam was talking about the terminology and did a good job of explaining how day neutrals work, some of the terms I might use, I thought I would define a strong day neutral, for example, would be something that seems to set more flower buds at higher temperatures, and a weak day neutral may be something that has gaps in production. So I know Adam explained the real reason for that, but this is how I perceive it to be. So I wanted you to have those terms handy when I'm referring to them later in this talk. I also thought I'd start with some examples of day-neutral varieties from different breeding programs that I'm not going to talk about today. Tribute and TriStar were two of the early day-neutral varieties some of you may be familiar with. They were developed in the United States, the USDA, for Eastern North America. So they truly are adapted to the Northeast, but they're very vigorous plants and they have good yields. The fruit is generally much smaller than we would find acceptable these days, although they may still have a niche market for certain growers. And these varieties, Tribute and TriStar, are available still from some plant growers. And then I listed some of the older day-neutral varieties from the University of California. They have had a long history of developing day neutrals, and you may have heard of some of these varieties like Fern and Selva, Aromas, which were very popular in their day, but are no longer widely grown. And finally, I wanted to point out that there are several plant breeding programs in Europe with day neutral varieties that make their way to North America. Typically, a plant grower secures the rights to distribute these varieties in North America. And so you'll see in catalogs from different plant growers day neutral varieties that have been developed in North America and may find a place here. So what I'm going to do is talk about the three most important varieties that I see in Ontario, and then I'll talk about three relatively new varieties that we tested last year. So the first one, and by far the most popular, is Seascape. This one was developed in the University of California and made its way to farmers' fields in approximately 1991. It's a cross with Selva, which is an older day-neutral variety, and Douglas. And Seascape has been very popular for a long time. The fruit is good quality, it's firm, it's a medium long, conic in shape, bright red. It produces the best yields in August and early September in our area, and it's widely grown and the most winter hardy variety that we have of the six that I'm talking about. The fruit we know are flavorful, but recently more and more growers are telling me that it does seem to develop an intense and sometimes unpleasant aroma in the heat of the summer. And although I've never experienced Seascape with an objectionable taste, I still love to eat this fruit. Growers do tell me that compared to some of the other varieties, it's not as nice all summer long. Another problem with Seascape is that it's very susceptible to powdery mildew. And this disease is not, we're not used to this disease on other June-bearing varieties, for example. We don't see it as often. And on Seascape, not only does it attack the leaves, which you can see in the lower right here, but it attacks the fruit, and it attacks the blossom. And so you can end up with smaller fruit and blossom abortion sometimes, and seeds that are that arrow isn't working, seeds that are prominent on the fruit, and some fruit cracking sometimes that can be due to powdery mildew. So it's very susceptible to mildew. You need a really good spray program to keep on top of it, and we are limited in the fungicides that we can use, at least in Canada, for powdery mildew. Another problem with Seascape, it's very susceptible to rain damage. So although it has high yields of nice large fruit, often after rain, growers have to go through and throw away a lot of the fruit. It's the skin just sort of melts away after a rain, and the fruit is unmarketable. Now, a lot of varieties do this, but Seascape does it quite badly. And it's important to have a well-shaped bed and a sloping bed to prevent some of that damage, but it is susceptible to rain. Now, throughout this talk, I'm going to show you some graphs of typical yield curves of these day-neutral varieties in the first year after planting. And the graphs come from some data that we collected this summer, funded by the Ontario Berry Growers Association. We put out 5 varieties of day neutrals at a few different sites. You can see on the map Bowmanville, Woodstock, Dunnville, and Delhi. And the graphs that I'm showing you all come from this site here in Woodstock, which is a fairly mild site compared to eastern and northern Ontario. So this was Seascape harvest in 2010 at my Woodstock site. We had small plots of 5 different varieties and harvest them twice a week all through the season. The plants were planted the 1st of May. Week 1 is July 20th, so that's when we began harvest, and week 12 was October the 7th, so we harvested till almost or just after Thanksgiving. The other thing to notice, you'll see the same in all these graphs, that we have the total marketable yield, unmarketable yield, and then the total yield. So the total yield is your blue line, and then the brown line is what was unmarketable, and marketable is the purple. You can see that Seascape is a fairly early variety with very good yields, high yields, particularly throughout August and early September. But, and I don't think you'll see this on any of the other graphs, the unmarketable yield is sometimes higher than the marketable yield, and that's not a very good thing. Those berries could have been unmarketable because they were small, or because they had rain damage, or because they were suffering from powdery mildew. Yeah, that was Canadian Thanksgiving. Okay, so Albion is another very popular variety in Ontario. Most growers are trying Albion, and many growers have moved substantially away from Seascape to Albion, especially in the warmer parts of the province. And the main reason is quality. Albion is a weak or moderate day neutral. The yields are not as high as Seascape, but the quality is very good. It's a conical fruit, bright red and shiny. The skin is not susceptible to bruising or rain damage, and it has excellent flavor. Also, Albion is more tolerant to powdery mildew and more tolerant to spider mites than Seascape. Oh, I should show you this too. This habit, I think, is fairly unique to Albion, where it ripens from the bottom up. So these are some of the things we've observed with Albion, Ontario. A very high percentage of marketable fruit, even though the yields are outstanding. The biggest drawback, I guess, to to Albion is, well, two drawbacks. The yields are lower than Seascape, and winter hardiness could be a problem. It's definitely not as hardy as Seascape if you overwinter the planting. Most growers do overwinter day neutral plantings in Ontario, and this is a field of Albion taken at the end of April. And you can see that there are some weak areas, some areas with strong plants. I'm trying to use this arrow, sorry. Some areas where the plants are stronger, and then some areas up at the foreground here where the plants are a little bit weaker. And they can recover from this type of damage, but in the end, it is winter injury. And we've noticed, especially with Albion, but with other varieties as well, that after the winter, rows in the center of a bed tend to be vigorous and more larger plants and less winter damage than the rows on the outside edges near the edge of the bed. And that's probably just due to a cold effect where there's more cold coming into the bed from the edges. These plants do seem to recover quite well, but they do, we don't know what the effect of sublethal winter injury could be. So this is a graph of Albion harvest in 2010 at that same site near Woodstock. You can see that the peak of production is later than Seascape, with week 6 being approximately August 23rd. So a lot of that yield came in after mid-August. You can also see that the percent, if you look at that purple line, the unmarketable fruit, not the percent, but the amount of unmarketable fruit is quite low and consistently low throughout the season. And this is some data comparing the cultivar Albion to the cultivar Seascape at one of the most northerly locations in Ontario, in New Liskeard, where Becky Hughes does research on strawberries, and she shared this slide with me. I thought you'd be interested to see, because it gives you some numbers to compare the yields of Albion to Seascape. And I think also you can see the effect of winter injury on the marketable yield in the second year. Becky says that that winter between 2008 and 2009, I think it was a fairly normal winter. There was 15% plant mortality in Albion after that winter. So it's really not as bad as you would expect for a location as far north as New Liskeard. These plants would have been protected with straw and a floating row cover for the winter. But you can see that the yield the second year and the berry size the second year is quite a bit smaller than it was the first year for both those varieties. Now the third variety that's still grown in Ontario to some extent, although not a lot, is EV2. This is a variety from the United Kingdom. And people People like it because the plants are vigorous, the fruit is large, it's light red and firm, it's fairly round. I think that most growers really prefer to have the longer conical fruit if they're exporting, or not exporting, if they're shipping their fruit to retail stores. The flavor is sweet, and it is somewhat earlier than Seascape, so those are the advantages of EV2. However, the fruit is too soft for most markets off the farm, and it is also very susceptible to rain damage. So there's not much EV2 grown in Ontario. We are looking forward to testing some of the newer siblings from this line of day neutrals in the future. So those were the three varieties that I've seen grown widely in Ontario: Seascape, Albion, a little bit of EV2, and now I'll talk about the three new ones from California, which are San Andreas, Monterey, and Portola. San Andreas is a cross with Albion in the parentage. It's a very large, firm fruit with excellent quality. The shape is good, it's medium to long conic, and it's very highly symmetrical in shape, which helps it look great in a basket. It's similar in season to Albion, and I think they selected it because yields are apparently higher than Albion, or at least they were higher in California. We noticed that San Andreas is a very attractive berry. It's got a nice large calyx, good flavor. It was very late for us, but we've only tested it for 1 year in a few locations in Ontario. So there could be physiological reasons why it was late. It was much later than Albion, and it's supposed to come in the same season as Albion. The plants for San Andreas were really vigorous, and I could see them across the field because they're so disease resistant. So where we could see powdery mildew and other leaf diseases on all the other varieties, San Andreas was remarkably clean. It is, however, susceptible to botrytis. And this is the yield curve for San Andreas, just 1 year, like I said, of harvest in southern Ontario. It had very high yields, but they didn't really start until the end of August and early September. And you can see that the unmarketable yield was fairly low and consistently low. The second new cultivar out of California, released at the same time, also with Albion in the parentage, is Monterey. And this one is probably the most similar of the three to Albion. And it was released also because it has apparently higher yields than Albion. It's got large red fruit, kind of an orangey red fruit, and vigorous plants. We noticed that the size and the yield of this variety were good, and that the flavor was good, but the quality is not what we're used to if you've grown Albion. So the skin seems a little bit thinner, seems a little more susceptible to rain damage, maybe a little more susceptible to leaf diseases and fruit rots. Still, it's a fine variety. If you can't get your hands on Albion, I would give Monterey a try. And this is the yield curve for Monterey, earlier than some of the others we've seen, and fairly productive with high yields and reasonably the unmarketable fruit is a little bit higher than San Andreas and Albion, but not terribly so. Finally, Portola, another cross from the University of California, released at the same time. It's touted as being a strong day neutral, which means you wouldn't see so many gaps in production, and you would expect it to come in a little bit earlier in Ontario, which it does. The fruit is a much orangier red than the others. It's a bit rounder in shape with a small calyx, and we saw high early yields with Portola. It is definitely an earlier berry than most of the others. The fruit does have kind of an unusual color to it. I don't know if it's the gloss or the shine or the color. It wasn't so rain tolerant as Albion, and my students did not like the taste. Now, they'd been spoiled on Albion. And this slide, I think, shows it is easy to pick out the color and the appearance of Portola. This is a basket of fruit with several varieties in the basket. But you can see on the lower right, that's where all the Portola are. They're much oranger, kind of duller, and almost plastic in color, but they would put up a very attractive pack for wholesale markets. And this is the yield curve for Portola. I think it has fairly high unmarketable yields, but also fairly high yields altogether. And you can see that it was much earlier than some of those other varieties, coming in at week 3, which was 3rd of August, as opposed to week 5 and 6 for some of the others. This graph is just one to show the size of the berries in these trials at this location throughout the summer. I think the thing to notice here is that Seascape had the smaller fruit, and Albion, Monterey, Portola were all very similar in fruit size, and the San Andreas may be a tiny bit bigger some times of the year. So I'm about ready to wrap up, and maybe we'll have time for some discussion, but I hope I've given you some points on choosing a variety. I think it's more than just yield for day neutrals, although yield is still an important consideration. Albion has really set the stage for flavor, and people have turned to Albion away from Seascape for that reason. The quality of fruit is important. How much fruit are you going to throw away for poor quality or rain damage? I think disease resistance is important if a variety is so susceptible to disease that you're going to have trouble controlling it with our limited toolbox. And we'll have to see what happens with winter hardiness. So Seascape is definitely a hardier variety for most of Ontario, more hardy than Albion. The advantage to these new varieties, Monterey, Portola, and San Andreas, may be that they're a little more hardy than Albion, and we need some more experience in the Northeast to find that out. And this is just my favorite slide of somebody with day neutral varieties in Ontario, and I'm really proud to work with growers that grow such beautiful fruit.
Thank you very much, Pam. Adam, if you'll join us again. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to type them into the chat box, and either of our speakers will reply. While we're waiting for those, I'm going to move to the end screen. Thank you all for joining us this week. Our second presentation will be next week in the Day Neutral Strawberry mini-series. We're going to be hearing about day neutral growing systems from Mr. Simon Parent, who's the president of Nova Fruit. And we'll also be hearing about fertility and fertigation from John Zanstra from the University of Guelph. Okay. There is a question from Ian McGregor. Pam, how much earlier is EV2 than Seascape? Pam?
Yeah. Oh, yes, I was typing the answer, but I guess I could answer it with my mic. Yeah.
Yes.
Anyways, hi, Ian. I haven't compared them. I think it's about a week earlier to get into bigger production, and I wonder if anyone else has experience with EV2 compared to Seascape.
I don't.
Also, I'm interested in knowing if who else has tried some of these newer varieties and what their experience is.
While we're waiting for people to weigh in on that, Michelle and Norbert have a question about varieties that would be suited to Edmonton and the north.
Ooh. Edmonton and the north. Well, there's a lot, the day neutrals would be suitable. There's quite a large acreage of day neutrals in Alberta, and there has been for a long time. A lot of growers have been growing fern.
Fern and also Seascape would be
Yeah,
okay. Don't you
yeah,
think, Adam, a good
yeah,
one to try?
yeah. Um,
Rob Black is on. Maybe Rob can tell us what they're growing in Alberta.
Otherwise, you look at the June berries, and my standard advice is you've got to try them and see. I know that our recent varieties, Seascape and Serenity, did very well in trials in Manitoba.
You mean Sapphire?
Sapphire, yeah. Sorry, I'm getting all the S's mixed up. But you know, again, you've got to try. You've got to try them in your environment, because you.
Thank you, David.
David Handley from Maine has commented that EV2 was 7 to 10 days earlier than Seascape in some years, and then in others only 3 to 5 days.
Thank you, Rob. Rob has a lot of experience with day neutrals in Alberta, and so that's confirming that it would be a good one to try. But it also depends to the people up near Edmonton whether you're going to grow them as an annual or whether you want to have them for 2 years.
Well, there's been but there's been some very good research out of Saskatchewan that has shown that if you cover them with plastic, you can get them through. You can get most strawberries through the winter very, very easily in those climates.
Yeah, that's what Becky's doing in New Liskeard, covering with straw and plastic.
Yeah.
And row cover.
Growing systems of day neutrals and high tunnels. Oh, it's plastic. Laura's asking, is it plastic or row cover? It's plastic, not row cover.
Although I think Becky's using row cover.
Yeah. But the research was done on plastic. In tunnels, I tend to, my feeling on tunnels is that in most areas it's not going to be economic because of the price you get for the berries, but I'll temper that with, I think if you are in an area where in the north where you have a very short growing season, the day tunnels could be very profitable, and we're doing some research with Becky. It's got the day neutrals under tunnels now at New Liskeard, and I think that in that kind of area it could be a very profitable enterprise. But certainly come down into southern Ontario and anywhere down south, further than that, the economics aren't going to work. Having said that, here in Florida they're starting to put tunnels up like crazy because in the winter they get very, very good high early season yields. But then again, that's in a cool growing season, and that's pushing the temperature up. When you get into northern areas and you have tunnels, the temperature in the tunnels is higher, and it suppresses the yield and the flower bud initiation. So, I think it's very regionally sensitive, if you like, as to whether tunnels will work or won't.
There's a question from John Brandstratter. Best varieties for Southern Ohio heat, he's asking.
Try them and see.
Well, I would suggest Albion for sure, because Seascape does tend to develop those off flavors in the heat of the summer.
Yeah, but
not really off flavors, but less flavorful than Albion.
But will Albion gap much higher in southern Ohio? I suspect it will.
It could. We didn't see much of a gap this year when it was quite hot, but I guess it wasn't as hot as most years.
And it depends when the heat is, Pam. If the heat's early, it will gap. If the heat's later, it's already set its flower buds, and if there's a gap, it'll sort of catch itself back up over the winter. So, yeah, in terms of fruit quality, I think Albion would be better. in Ohio than Seascape, but I wonder about the gapping.
So maybe an EV2 would probably be too soft.
Way too soft.
So maybe try some Portola because it had great quality. The flavor wasn't good for us, but the flavor could change with the region.
Here's the story. Try 'em and see.
Are there any other questions? It looks like there may be one or two more. Thank you all for participating today. I really appreciate your patience. We had a few issues with audio, but for the most part, I think it went really well.
What are the summer temperatures in Ontario? Well, in southern Ontario, you can get days in the low 30s, and sometimes in August, nights in the low 25 to 28 Celsius. Once you get further north, again, you can get a few days into the 30s, but by and large the temperatures are much lower. It just depends where you are, because Ontario is a big province. How does Albion yield in the second season? Well, some growers have had very good yields with it, luck with it in southern Ontario. Again, it depends where you are.
About 30% less than Seascape.
Okay, yeah.
Every year,
Yeah.
it's about 35% less than Seascape. And then with the winter damage, if you had winter damage, which isn't as severe as we're waiting for the big winter to sort out these varieties. They haven't had a good test. But if there was winter damage, you may lose a lot of that early yield on Albion, like maybe 50%. But I think it would catch back up. Yeah.
I was wondering about what Kevin's comment about is yield reduction between varieties marketable yield. I would say my gut feel is that Albion has more marketable yield than Seascape, and that you'd lose in Seascape, you'd lose marketable yield to unmarketable yield. What spacings do we use? We're going 4 rows on a diagonal pattern on a bed, foot apart between the rows, a foot apart between the plants.
The Charles and Woodstock were a 2-row bed, but 12 by 12 inch spacing.
You don't need 8 inches is the absolute minimum. You want to go within the row. Anything and then that's tight, and you will increase your yields, but that will give you a lower yield per plant the tighter you get. So it's a sort of balance between yield per acre versus yield per plant.
All right then, thank you very much, Pam and Adam. Thank you everyone for participating, and we will be back with you again next week.
Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye now.